it will be interesting to see how that dynamic changes as more and more of these artists or their estates have kind of a representation that we didn't see 20 years ago, 15 years ago, with, of course, the internationalization of the art market where, Afro-Cobra artists can be shown at the Venice Biennale by a gallery owner, Mertice Berdola, from the DC area. She's not a blue chip big thing, but that shows you how much you can show and how open the world is now, and the art will travel.
Welcome to the Artelligence Podcast. Live Art's look behind the scenes at how the global art market really works. I'm your host, Marion Maneker. This podcast is brought to you by Live Art, the global art marketplace that puts you in control. Download the Live Art app to get all of the most relevant art market information, as well as access to exclusive private sales. Or visit us at liveart.io. African American artists have been stars in the art market for the last several years, but long before Black painters were featured in the marquee evening sales, Nigel Freeman was building the African American art market one sale at a time at Swann Auction Galleries. His semi-annual auction takes place on March 31st, featuring the work of Norman Lewis, Hughie Lee Smith, Ed Clark, and Kenneth Victor Young. In this podcast, we talk about the 15-year journey towards defining this field and the opportunities mainstream success has brought to African American artists. I hope you'll enjoy it. Nigel Freeman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Marion. Thank you.
You've been running these sales in the African American art department at Freeman's at Swann Galleries. Exactly, the confusion of the two. You've been running these sales at Swann Galleries for 12 years now, 13?
15 years of auctions, yes, in February. So it's not a new thing anymore. We've certainly had a history now.
Well, you not only have a history, but the rest of the world has discovered this category and expanded on it greatly. And instead of that impacting your sales negatively, it seems to have, if anything, helped them grow even further. So I thought, with that in mind, maybe you could take us back 15 years ago and sort of explain what it was like to start an African American art department, where you were getting the works and who the buyers were and what kind of reaction you got.
Yeah, it's a totally different landscape, Marion. We've come a long way. And when I started, I founded this department here at Swann Galleries back in 2006, in the fall of 2006. And it came out of my experience working in the Works on Paper department here at Swann. So I've had two careers here. Seeing the interest in African American art, but not seeing anything really deliberately consigned to auction, collectors not selling at auction, and the auction world really not knowing much about African art, but knowing a little bit myself. I was always curious to see how it would happen when we actually deliberately put together sales. And we had the opportunity in 2005 because I was able to get the estate of Harry Henderson, who wrote with Romare Bearden sort of a standard text on African American art in the 90s. And his son, Albert Henderson, who's also a writer, consigned his father's estate to us, which included two excellent Romare Bearden collages. As he was friends with Bearden, he had great Beardens, two that were in a National Gallery show. So we waited for the show to end, curated by the great Ruth Fine. And around that collection, which included also an abstract Bearden and, of course, several Bearden prints, I was able to get enough of a group of African-American artists, Lois Mailou Jones, Ellen Cricht, Doc Thrash, and put together a section in our modern sales. And it was really exciting. And people really responded. The Bearden sold for what was a record price at the time. And so we knew that the demand was there. At least I was able to prove that the demand was there. We did that twice, doing sections of Black artists in sort of modern sections. And with that success, the consignors, the people who wanted to sell, came out of the woodwork. They were like, finally, there is a venue to sell work where the prices represent what we perceive as the value, et cetera. Because before that, it was really a group of galleries and dealers that focused on African-American art, who did excellent sales. Michael Rosenfeld and Bill Hodges and June Kelly and others, but there was no venue for buying and selling in the secondary market like auction. So that's what I stepped into, a world where there were very few auction records, where one had to be very careful in how you valued work. We took it very seriously. I wanted to give the department kind of a focus on really the artist, the African-American artist, developing their stature, putting the work into context, providing the history that made their contributions more relevant and part of American art history. So we worked on it for a while, and it grew. It grew.
So it was almost a build it and they will come kind of strategy.
Yes.
But it's clear that it worked in sort of both directions, that the people who were buying from you were also the consignors, I'm assuming, because they were seeing this work on both sides. And as any collector does, there's always stuff that goes out as new stuff comes in. And I got the impression also that in that era, many of the collectors had bought works directly from the artists. Mm-hmm. That, a lot of where you were getting source from, you would look at the provenance and it would be, acquired directly from the artist by, right, doctors, lawyers, all sorts of middle-class people who had bought works of art, often in the 50s, 60s, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, the interesting thing about this part of the secondary market is we're not far removed from the artist. There's not really much ownership history in many of the works that we sell. And still today, I mean, we're not a gallery, but we do work closely with some artist estates and some descendants of artists who have inherited works. And so we feel, that proximity to the artist, of course, because the work is still in many people's families. And then, like you said, many, especially African-American professionals and successful people who could collect, started buying works directly, often from artists, as well as, from galleries. And many artists were giving their work to people instead of selling it. I mean, we sell many works by Norman Lewis, but more than half, I would say, were not bought at his gallery, Willard Gallery. There were gifts or people, friends and family that he gave the works to.
Norman Lewis is one of the sort of central artists of your sales, right? Mm-hmm. When you have a significant Lewis, it's usually, one of the 10 poles, both in terms of value, but also attracting people. And I'm trying to think through some of the other artists. Hughie Lee Smith seems to appear in a bulk of the sales. Elizabeth Catlett. There's a series. And it almost seems like your sales are still focused on historical artists, where the growth of the rest of the art market and the other auction houses is primarily around current artists working whose secondary markets are building because the demand just can't be met by the galleries and all. Right. And with the exception of one or two, Sam Gilliam, a few Norman Lewises when they appear, Barkley Hendricks, who you developed that market, and he kind of exploded into the mainstream auction houses. There does seem to be like your market is more historical and the auction houses are more sort of present-minded, or is that?
Well, no, that's a good point. And it's part of that is a function of where we were back then, what we were just talking about in 2007, 2008, when we stepped into this market. Of course, contemporary artists were plugged in. They were part of the gallery scene. But we quickly saw that these, major important artists, the first generation, if you will, of modern artists, outside of Bearden and Jacob Lawrence, were not represented. And these were fantastic artists. So yeah, absolutely. Charles White, Elizabeth Catlett, Hughie Smith, the names you mentioned, and more, Charles Alston, Hale Woodruff. That market was completely open to us, and we quickly cemented kind of new benchmarks for those artists. In our first sale, and our second sale was a very important corporate collection, the Golden State Mutual Life collection, which had fantastic paintings. We're major drawing by Charles White, painting by Hughie Smith, etc. So the modern artists have been certainly our foundation. And of course, now we've seen the second generation of abstract artists who have been sought after now for the last 5 to 10 years. Of course, Sam Gilliam, but others of that generation, whether it's Kenneth Victor Young or William T. Williams or others who are that next generation of artists, or Dina, Pindell, or whoever. Yeah, we were able to really build out sales in many of those areas, and that has been our strength, and it is still our strength today. It's kind of Hughie Smith is an amazing artist, and Elizabeth Catlett. And what's wonderful about them is they had very lengthy careers. I mean, they kept working into the 90s. Hughie Smith is so consistent. Of course, his work is now being discovered at some of the other auction houses, but we were able to sell his work, but not just focus on the one period that all the collectors were focused on, his prime 50s period. There's 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And as we had access to some of these works, the market has kind of come along and caught up with those type of sales. So that's been an area we've been able to continue with. And it's wonderful. And Charles White and Norman Lewis deserve to be in the biggest sales, right? I mean, that's the reality that they're major artists. They should be in the evening sales. That's their rightful place. But we've also been able to continue to do what we're doing because, just as Norman Lewis was an important figure, his friends and cohorts, Hale Woodruff and Charles Alston, how can you talk about Norman Lewis without those two? And we've been selling their work for a long time.
How does the collector base work? Years ago, there was an impression that there were a couple of, and this is not exclusive to this market, think of the American furniture market was greatly affected by one or two, collectors who had set very high prices and somewhat set agendas for other collectors. And for a period, it's my impression there were a couple of big name collectors in this space. But did that create more people coming in, or did a sort of different group of collectors develop? As you've been doing this for 15 years, so you're seeing a lot of repeat customers. I'm assuming you've developed a lot of relationships. You should have some sense of how this has all changed over 15 years.
Yeah, no, it's changed and it's continued. That's the beauty of this, and that's how we've been so fortunate. Is, Marion, we have clients who have been buying at our auctions for 15 years. So we have these wonderful collectors who are comprehensive, encyclopedic kind of collectors who keep coming back, or collectors who have, an expansive portfolio, if you will, of artists. But the landscape has changed, at the beginning and even before auctions, in the 80s and 90s, as we mentioned earlier, African-American collectors wanted to acquire the masters, and build sort of encyclopedic collections. And now we're working across many kind of areas of collecting. We're dealing with people who have very narrow focus. We're selling kind of a broad swath of American art, from 19th century Tanner to,
Duncanson.
Yeah, or someone like that, into something very contemporary. What kept us going, and really what was the bridge for where we were at the very beginning to where we, after the mid, early teens, was institutions. So especially got us through the sort of lean years after 2008. I mean, I had an auction the week that the stock market fell off a cliff in 2008 in October. We had an auction that week. Cover lot was a Norman Lewis, wonderful collection from the family of a judge and ambassador, Edward Dudley. And that collection was fought over by two museums. The Norman Lewis you'll see in the collection of MFA in Boston. So museums early on were starting to reconfigure their American art collections. So that sustained us through the 09s and 10s. And then we've just seen an explosion in interest, especially in the last 5 years, if you've well documented, in the internationalization of African art. These are the now recognized, like, some of the leading American artists. So we don't have to talk about Sam Gilliam as an African-American artist. He's a trailblazing American artist. right? Or Howard Dina Pindell or someone like that. So with that, there's just been a tremendous growth in people who are sometimes collecting for the first time one of these artists, and also people who have built out collections in, let's say, color field abstraction, and now like, well, who's Kenneth Victor Young, or who's so we're adding to those type of collectors. I mean, I think the thing that kind of made it apparent how global it was with Soul of a Nation, how that show was created and started in London by two English curators and brought all this wonderful work out of American collections. So yeah, it's really changed, really broadened.
Well, there's an appeal to that because that show especially kind of focused on a particular period,
Mm-hmm.
and it had a kind of whole cool around it,
Mm-hmm.
both the political side of it, but just the cultural appeal. The Soul of a Nation is a great way to make a transition to talk about the Barkley Hendricks market, because he seemed to capture for so many the kind of cool of that period.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a certain section of the work he produced, but not the entirety of it. But it certainly led the way. And you sold some of the first ones, and I was just curious to hear the reaction to that work. Were there people familiar with it, or was it just a complete discovery?
We just had, with the first figurative large scale painting of his, Angie, which actually it was consigned to us, and the curators, I don't think, were thrilled during the traveling exhibition of The Birth of Cool, the retrospective. So it had been on a couple of the first two venues, I think the PAFA and then the Studio Museum, and then it came to us. So it was at a time where you think people would have had woken up to him because he was having a traveling retrospective. It wasn't some obscurity that, and of course Trevor Schoonmaker had put together this like amazing show. He's such a great curator, and I had one little basketball painting of Barkley Hendricks before that, which is actually up in a show at Jack Shaman right now. But it shows how even then, like, it would have been a very different moment today with the exposure that show would have had. So it was to people in our world, it was an amazing show, but it hadn't reached this kind of higher level. And you still saw that. It was still kind of odd to me, like with the Norman Lewis show and others traveling, that they hadn't reached kind of a national consciousness. But to get back to Barkley, that was a painting that had been in an artist's family, and they consigned it to us, and it was acquired by the Sheldon Museum, which is a wonderful collection of American art. Not where you'd think the most trailblazing collecting would be, but they were, and they collected some fantastic paintings from us again at that time in 08, 09.
Driven by a curator or by
Yes, Daniel Veneziano, who was at the Studio Museum prior to that, was the chief curator who led their. It was smart. He got some wonderful things at prices today that people would gladly pay.
The Studio Museum has seeded so much of the current art world with people. I mean, that's not
Yeah.
surprising to hear you say that. It is great to see the Hendricks sort of develop. I'm not aware how much work there is out there. I know Shaman is still quite involved with the estate and all, but I assume we'll continue to see more of these works, or are they mostly passing into museums?
Well, I think with Barkley Hendricks' work, and we had a nice run with the work until we got to, I guess it was 2012 or 13. We had two of the large white paintings. One of those now, Steve, is in the collection of the Whitney Museum that was acquired at Swann. They got up to what would be still a fraction today. They were in the mid $300,000-$400,000 range at auction then. That was the record. And it's a tight market for Barkley. There are not many works of his. He was a productive artist, but not a prolific artist. So these large figure pieces are such a hot commodity because they are so scarce. So they are, yeah, they're either in collections. There are few that are kind of no longer under the radar, so to speak. We were fortunate to have some that were acquired early by supporters, doctors, and people who supported his early career in Philadelphia when he was showing at like Ken Galleries before he went to ACA in New York and things like that. So that's where some of them were, but they're, he's such a wonderful artist. I mean, I think it's still a great
opportunity.
He's an amazing artist. If I had that money, I would consider it too. Yeah, it's really, he's really just kind of this amazing talent and kind of very much of the moment. Of course, with the people, the way they were dressed, it was totally kind of evocation of the 60s and 70s. But he's also this like brilliant classical trained painter. He went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. He knew all the academic techniques. He was the only figurative painter probably at Yale when he got his MFA. But yeah, he's amazing.
Other artists like that, and you were talking about the traveling retrospective and the importance of a museum show, and it makes me think about, there's this great Faith Ringgold show at the new museum right now, and there's some work is owned by some very significant collectors. You can see it in the cards in the show and all. Will we see more of her work come to auction? It's not my impression, actually, that, the work she makes and her mark is a little different for that. But, in generally, museum shows create auction opportunities in other markets. And I'm curious to hear your sort of take on your own.
Yeah, I mean, Faith Ringgold is a wonderful artist, and we've been fortunate to have some amazing work of her, especially the work that was part of the estate of Dr. Maya Angelou. It was this amazing story quilt of hers commissioned by Oprah, Faith Ringgold, and an image of Maya Angelou. It's like this triumphant of awesome Black womanhood in that work. And it went to the Crystal Bridges Museum. And, I think it's interesting with Faith Ringgold. Yeah, I think there will be more works of hers coming to auction. I think you're right. The demand is certainly there. She's had a long history and strong representation with ACA, so she's kind of had a steady representation in gallery shows with her current gallery, unlike some other artists where, the representation has shifted and changed over the time. And I think that's a big factor in these artists. So you can see how an artist like Sam Gilliam kind of had this weird period where he was in between galleries and in the 90s and the O's, and just like kind of disappear. His work is in all these museum collections, but he was not really where he should have been in the secondary market. So I think, today there's so many galleries that are really looking for these type of career artists that's going to change.
Is there a balance then between, if there is a gallery that has a strong position in the market, less comes to auction? In plenty of parts of the art world, there's a somewhat of a conflict between the auction houses and the galleries, and I presume, especially if you've got a long relationship with a particular artist, that gives you even more control over their market, especially if the artist wants it that way, and would make it less likely that things come to you to be part of your auctions.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a factor. I think it's a factor because where we had, as we were saying earlier, like where in the beginning, where so many artists still had large holdings in families or collections, and they weren't represented. And
there was no one to go back to and say, right. Get a call from and say, hey, I know you've had that for 30 years, but I've got someone who would really love it, and it won't hurt. We'll give you a nice price for it.
Yeah, no, so that I think it will be interesting to see how that dynamic changes as more and more of these artists or their estates have kind of a representation that we didn't see 20 years ago, 15 years ago, with, of course, the internationalization of the art market where, Afro-Cobra artists can be shown at the Venice Biennale by a gallery owner, Mertice Berdola, from the DC area. She's not a blue chip big thing, but that shows you how much you can show and how open the world is now, and the art will travel.
But the publicity factor of a strong sale, it's not just you sort of providing that to other auction houses. People come to you when they see you sell something well, either to sell something similar or when they're looking for, they're an underbidder, they missed out, and they want to be there first in line for the next time.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. We build on our successes, especially with these artists that we've been talking about, Elizabeth Catlett, Hughie Smith, where because of the internet, the great thing about being in auction world is it's pretty transparent. You can see what we had, you can see what we sold it for, and so there's no mystery. And it's, you can find that on at home. You don't need access to the New York art market to do that.
So before we go, let's close with a commercial for your upcoming sale, since this should come out about a week before the sale. I saw you do have a Kenneth Victor Young, you have a Norman Lewis, you have an Ed Clark work. There's a Catlett. Do you want to and a Hughie Lee Smith? Do you want to pick a couple and tell us a little bit about some of the leading lots?
Thank you so much. Yes, Marion. I'm happy to plug my next sale. On March 31st, at the end of the month, we will have another sale. We do these auctions twice a year. And so the spring auction and our fall auction feature modern and contemporary. And I think it will be very interesting sale. Yeah, you mentioned some of the artists we're featuring. I think we're seeing a lot of growing interest in the market in Hughie Lee Smith, and we have a wonderful group of his work. As I said in our talk, he had a long career, and we have a range of his work. So we have like a 1960 painting of his that was in the Johnson Publishing Company collection, sold privately before we got the collection. So that's coming to auction, as well as work into the 90s. And then, like you said, we're building on some of our successes. So we're continuing to offer some great women artists and contemporary artists that we've been developing in this market. Howard Dina Pindell is one, and we have really two great, more of her assemblages, the collage with punched paper holes and wonderful elements made out of postcards from the early 80s. She's a really interesting artist in this market, and we have two of her works. And we're excited also to have a couple of groups of consignments that are collections, and contemporary art mark we want to keep developing. So in the last sale, we had some significant sales for a Latin American Cuban artist, Belkis Ayon, who does collagraphs. We have more of her work, and plus we've added some other contemporary artists like Mikita Ohuya, who's a newer artist of African American descent, who's shown internationally in London. We're excited to have a painting by her. So we're growing in different directions, building on our successes, but also trying to introduce artists.
But the sales will remain African American, not African diaspora. Now that we have so many more, you mentioned earlier, we have so many more African diaspora artists who have become rather successful globally.
Yes. Well, we're flexible. I don't think you can be too narrow. And there's some natural affinity with some of these artists. So we've always kind of been open, and we can try it. So, we've had, for example, work by an artist who's Ethiopian, Skundra Bogosian, but he lived and works in the United States for a long period of time, taught at Howard, so we sold his work. So it does, and we will include more of the diaspora. I think what people call African American artists, it's changing. It's changing. It's more inclusive. When we started, we were the African American Fine Art Department, so we changed our name too, quietly, a couple of years ago.
Come up with a new term, and you can expand the scope.
I think so. But we are still building our sales around some of the great pillars of 20th century art who are African American. Elizabeth Catlett and Hughie Smith
Well,
are
it
two of
also
them.
seems like there's plenty of room for just the growth in value. I mean, your
Absolutely.
sales have been sort of around 3 to 5 million over the last several years, and a lot of that is just the sort of average value of these lots are rising. But even with that, it's still not compared to what we're seeing in the bigger auction houses. The average value is still in the five figures, even in the low
Sure.
five figures. So that one would think there's a fair room for growth in value, especially, you mentioned Howard Dina Pindell a couple of times. There's a long-standing artist, but maybe not the most developed of markets and all. And one would think that there was also an opportunity in many of these artists for there to be continued value growth, even on repeat sales of some of the works that have passed through.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've been doing it long enough that we've had people who have acquired works in our auctions in 2008 and 9 who have now reconsigned in the last couple of years. So it's definitely a trend, and I think there's great value, and I think you're going to see. We saw it recently. Some of these artists are just ready to have their work go to the next level. We did it in the fall with a wonderful painting by Hale Woodruff. He was an artist who the right painting just hadn't come to auction for him. So with some of these artists, that's all that needs to happen. Is just the right painting in the market today can make a big leap possible.
Looking for that breakout moment.
Absolutely. Yes.
Nigel, thank you so much for taking the time to explain all of this. It's been fascinating. I really appreciate it.
It's been great. It's been fun. Marion, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us at the Artelligence Podcast, edited by Colin Ketchen, who also composed the original music. For more episodes, listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to download the LiveArt app or visit us at liveart.io. Please join us for the next episode of the Artelligence Podcast. We're looking forward to it.